Friedrich Nietzsche is another German philosopher of the 19th century who stands within this long conversation, beginning with Kant, going through Hegel, Schopenhauer, and so forth. But he makes a marked contribution of his own, which really signals him out for his own study, his own couple of weeks of study. His corpus is immense. He wrote quite a bit on quite a number of topics, and his thought went through a series of stages, a series of developments, before he finally broke down towards the end of his life into insanity. He is remembered for a number of core concepts in ethics and to a degree in metaphysics that shaped the thought of people, especially on the continent coming after him, and has more and more shaped the thought of Anglo-American philosophers in the last half of the 20th century. So what are some of the core concepts that Nietzsche is known for? I want to discuss his so-called reevaluation of all values and his concept of the superman, or of the higher man, as he would later call it. Because it's in this context that you see the real radical and different nature of Nietzsche's thinking begin to emerge. Nietzsche sees himself as engaged in a project which signals the kind of overthrow a lot of the traditional values and traditional moral categories and beliefs that marked the Western world prior to his arrival. He's famous for the proclamation that God is dead. He's famous for his assaults on Christianity, on Christendom, and on Kantian philosophy, and the sort of rationalist modes of thought that were in vogue before him. As a matter of fact, he's famous for lashing out at just about everybody, including most of his contemporaries. What do you mean by the revaluation of all values? Well, some people think of Nietzsche as simply, going forward with a kind of all-out assault against morality, period. But it doesn't really make too much sense to think of Nietzsche as doing something like that. I mean, just think of the term revaluation of all values. If you're reevaluating values, you are evaluating them, and you've got to do that from a standpoint of value of some kind. If you're reevaluating morality and you're making a set of normative criticisms of morality, you've got to do that from a standpoint of normativity. You've got to do that from some kind of ethical standpoint. So it's not really an all-out assault on morality as such. It is an assault on what Nietzsche identifies as being a kind of slave morality, a morality that typified the Christian tradition and the Western world, and which he thought was formulated in effect by the weak at the expense of the strong. So the revaluation of values that he embarks upon is one that involves him in a number of philosophical controversies concerning descriptive claims that are used to support descriptive theses that are used to underwrite this kind of morality that he despises. One of the descriptive claims is the claim that we possess a kind of libertarian freedom of will. The idea that he had, which isn't implausible, is that free will, understood as we typically understand it, is in fact incompatible with determinism. It requires a kind of ability to, as he said, pull ourselves out of the swamps of nothingness by our own hair, a kind of self-creation. And he thinks it's impossible to create yourself, to create your own character, and to be free in that sense. Rather, he thinks that you're situated, you're informed by your physiological constitution and your historical framework, among other things. So you don't possess the kind of freedom of will that traditional morality requires. He also thinks that our motivations are not transparent to us in the way we typically assume that they are. When you evaluate someone's behavior, morally speaking, you evaluate their conduct, but you also evaluate their motives. You evaluate the intention with which they act and what their goals were. And that assumes that we're able to identify what their real motives are. Indeed, when you're performing self-evaluation, it requires you to assume that you are transparent to yourself, in the sense that you can access your own motivations and know what they are. Nietzsche doesn't think this either. He thinks that, the way that you behave and the way that you think is really grounded in the type of character that you are, the type of person you are. And the type of person you are is something that is grounded more or less in your physiology and is something not within your control. So a lot of your actions, your conduct, emanate from your sort of physiological constitution and display you as either being healthy or weak or whatever. And then later on, these sort of moral claims and moral evaluations that we make are used to sort of rationalize, justify, and set in a specious, reasonable light what we do and why we do it. Finally, there was the thought that within traditional morality, that morals are universalizable. They apply to all and sundry in the same way. So think here of Kant's categorical imperative. He says you should act only in such a way that you treat humanity in yourself and in others as ends in themselves and not merely as means to an end, okay? And again, that you should act only in such a way that you can will the maximum on which you act to be universal law binding on all. That clearly presupposes that moral laws are universal or objective and apply to everybody irrespective of what kind of person they are. He thinks that's false, and in fact, he thinks it's detrimental to the superman or the higher men who are marked by a more noble character type and a stronger sort of temperament, and who are frustrated in their pursuit of perfection, human excellence, by the weaker, by the slave mentality that foists a so-called objective morality upon us just in order to keep down, right, to hold back those who could pursue a higher, more excellent mode of existence. Now, what is this higher, more excellent mode of existence? When I use terms like excellence and pursuit of a good life and so forth, you're apt to hear in that something like an Aristotelian eudaimonia. You're looking to flourish and to possess happiness in that full-blooded sense. That's not exactly what Nietzsche means by that. In a number of passages, he mocks the idea of a person whose sole purpose is to find happiness. He thinks that they're marked by a kind of slavish, a kind of inferior mentality. Rather, what the excellent person is marked by is not their happiness, but the way in which they come out through the other side of suffering in a way that makes them stronger and in a way that exerts their own will to power. So Nietzsche's view, sort of like Schopenhauer's, has a kind of willful drive at the back of it, but it's an individualized willful drive that applies not to everyone, but only to the sort of masters or the higher or supermen who are going to shuck off these specious categories of good and evil that they have been handed down and are going to live according to their own higher law.